My name is Byndon. I'm the chair of the MORE board, which is Moving to Omaha for Race Equity. And our mission is MORE is an anti-racist organization fighting for racial equity in communities through engagement, education, and advocacy. And this group started about 10 years ago under a group called Progressive Resource and Innovation. There was another group that started before that. And so we've kind of evolved, and one of our mission statements that we moved to is to deal with anti-racism, race equity, because there are very few, if any, organizations that have that in their mission statement in Omaha, Nebraska. And with all the craziness going on in our community and our state, all the racists come out of the closet, racist statements, there should be a nonprofit addressing these issues. And so one of the things that we do in this organization, we interview community leaders and people and grasstops and grassroots about issues of the day and some of their experiences of dealing with racial issues in our community. And so today we invited Dennis Womack, who's a longtime community advocate who ran for many elected offices. I was following his career as he did that. He served at one point as a deputy election commission in Douglas County. I got to know Dennis since he worked for the Nebraska Urban League, and he was involved in many community forums and events dealing with the African-American community in particular. And particularly empowerment and grass tops of grassroots residents. He's always been involved in social justice issues, and so I'm kind of excited that he's able to join us today. He's one of the very few people that I'm aware of who have a historical background of what has happened from an African-American or grassroots perspective in Omaha. I know he left the city for a number of years, but again, Dennis is a historian of sorts, because he can tell you a lot of things that happen in this community, which a lot of young people don't know that. And I'm not much on long-winded introduction, so I'm going to cut to the chase and say that years ago I had an academic advisor. He was the head of minority multicultural affairs in Lincoln when I was an undergraduate. And he talked about some of these young Negroes, and he at that time was being somewhat reflective that he called them somewhat integration babies, and I know what he meant. But he said that some of them didn't understand what we went through as old school people who were involved in the movement. And he says that we haven't done a great job to pass on our legacy and our history to them. And so one of the things I know that Dennis is very much involved in is doing just that. And in Omaha, Nebraska, we tend to have this situation. We're bringing these carpetbaggers and these Uncle Toms and handkerchief heads in our community, put them in key positions, and they work for a number of years and they go back to their own plantation cities. And so that's part of the problem that we deal with in Nebraska, particularly in Omaha. So I invited Dennis on to just talk about some of the issues he's been involved in. And obviously someone who has the tenacity and wherewithal to continue to be involved for this many years is very wonderful. So Dennis, I gave just a brief overview a little bit, but can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself? And then we'll get right into kind of the conversations of the reason for our presentation, our conversation and dialogue today. So Dennis, tell me a little bit more about yourself.
Absolutely. And thank you, Brother Ajamal. Well, you know, I'm a native Nebraskan, born in the poorest part of Nebraska, which was once called the Plumnelly neighborhood, which is now identified as the Malcolm X birth site. I can tell you back in the day that there were dirt roads up there, and when it would rain, most of our parents had to park their cars down on 30th Street in order to get to and from work, because there was so much mud up there, the cars would get stuck. So that's pretty much where I come from. I come from very humble beginnings. And I've learned a long time ago that as a descendant of the meat packing industry and a meat packing industry family, I knew that I was always going to be afforded the opportunity to work hard for a living, because many opportunities didn't exist back then. However, I attended Omaha Public Schools, and in 1968 would have been the last time that I attended a public school in Omaha, Nebraska. And that was due to the fact that the Nebraska Democratic Party at that time allowed a racial bigot to come to Nebraska and spew his racial hatred in Omaha, and that was the George Wallace. Myself and some other young Blacks in the community who were really dedicated Democrats at that time because of our family history being Democrats. We attended the meeting to do what we considered to be a peaceful protest. And then in that protest, as the N word began to fly around, not only from George Wallace at that time, but many of the people in the audience, some of us kind of got a little angry. So we decided to go down and kind of confront him face to face. Well, as you know from the history of all of that, riots ensued that night. Individuals got killed in Omaha, Nebraska, who I grew up with. And the next day, I was on front page of the Omaha World Herald. I attended my class that following day, and I noticed that the teachers had a little bit of angst towards me, so to speak. And all that day, there was a lot of turmoil and trouble to where fights ensued at school. And next day, my father said, you know, I couldn't be creating problems like that in Omaha because he was an employee of Omaha Public Schools at that time. And that.
So in other words, he sent you to California then?
That's how I ended up in California.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and my first week in California, fortunately, I was afforded the opportunity to find out what true Black history was.
By the way, what city were you in, Dennis? What city are you in California? Where were you living at?
I lived in Riverside, California. I went to a high school there that had 5,000 students.
Okay, and so how long did you stay in California?
Well, that time I stayed there for 3 years until I completed high school.
And then came back to Omaha.
Then came back to Omaha. And fortunately, I was able to find a pretty good job. I worked for Nebraska, the state of Nebraska, the Nebraska Psychiatric Institute, which a lot of us may remember, used to sit right there on the medical center campus.
Right.
Myself.
NPI, right.
Yeah, NPI, absolutely. So I did a lot of volunteer work with other organizations like Equilibria, Richard Young, and my goal was to make sure that individuals who had, you know, got involved in drugs or something like that were able to get into what we had as a pilot program, which was a methadone maintenance program, which was the first in the nation. So I would work, you know, overtime at night and go out in the streets late at night, and people would say, well, you're too young to be out here trying to hustle people back to get help. But I found that the people on the streets actually appreciated that, the work that I was doing.
So Dennis, let me ask you, when I met you, you were working at the Urban League, I think. So you had a series of jobs between them. And I know when also at the end of my contact with you, I know you had worked with the Douglas County Election Commission. So in other words, what you're saying, you had like maybe at least 5 or 6 different jobs from the time you came back to Omaha at least?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. I worked at Enron, actually, Northern Natural Gas Company.
Which people don't know what that is, but that was one of the corporations, which was like InterNorth and so on, to deal with the gas agenda.
Absolutely.
So it was real famous in Nebraska. They had a scandal and so on.
Absolutely. Well, and by working for Enron, what we did was we were contracting with the city of Omaha.
Okay.
It was a federal funded program which bought Comprehensive Employment Training Agency into the Omaha area.
Which was CETA, which was part of the program that helped people get jobs and mainstream into the regular place. I'm going to switch up because I'm going to get right into the question. I know we don't have a lot of time. People, I remember one of the things that you ran for office, and each time you ran for office and lost, you ran again for another office over a series of years. I mean, it wasn't like you just did it right in that. And so my question is when you ran for office, it's not being successful in Omaha, what made continue to stay engaged in public policy issues? Because many times when people run for office, I use one example. Years ago, my mother ran for school board, and she lost to Karen Shepherd, who was not the sharpest blade on social justice, but she was a nice person. And I say that very respectfully, but my mother was more the advocate type. And again, people picked who they wanted to pick. And we got the public schools that we deserve and we got right now. But my point is, when you didn't get elected, what made you stay and run for another office? And I think there was at least 3. I think you ran for city council, county commissioner, and there was something else. But tell me a little bit about what was in your head when you ran for office, you lost, and you still ran again.
Well, the thing that was in my head, and it's still in my head today, is the issues that this community is confronted with. We still have high pockets of poverty, and I'm sure with your background and your teaching background, you're aware that in 2014 we were #2 in poverty per capita. The thing that I didn't understand is how the people who were affected by these high pockets or high level of poverty didn't even know that they were #2 in poverty. So it was
You say
always
when you say #2, we were ranked #2 in the country,
in the
proportional
country
to our number. I wouldn't say that we had more poor people than anywhere, but if you look at our percentages,
per
Omaha had one
capita.
of the highest concentration of poverty, and many of the city leaders and public officials were shocked by that study that came out. What in the World Herald did that?
Absolutely. Not only were they shocked, but I think they suppressed the story.
Okay.
So to so that the people wouldn't be able to identify the level of poverty that they were actually enduring around here. So my message was always to inform people. And I think that's something that we still lack today in the political spectrum, is that when people get elected, they have a tendency to not know what they need to do. But I think what's always helped me was my ability to have had opportunity to work on the federal government level, which you and I know many of us never get that opportunity, specifically being here in Nebraska.
Right.
It's so many things that our people are unfamiliar with as to how things like the census works, how funding streams work. And I think that my awareness really became paramount when I was able to work for the United States Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, because I like the statistical analysis. And I think that's one of the things that maybe could have been my shortcoming, is that I only learned that language. And many people don't understand that language, but they need to learn that, because that's what makes the system drive. That data is what.
So Dennis, help me. This is when you ran for office, and again, obviously, I assume when you were competing with your candidates, your opposition folks, or your colleagues, or whatever. What was that like for you? Did they give you the respect as a candidate? Did you advance the issues of the community? My point I'm really leading to is, how did what you wanted get advanced by the opposition who won that seat? I mean, you can name drop who you ran against, but did they incorporate any of the ideals or issues that you were working on, that you were advocating for?
No. I'll tell you something as simple as workforce initiatives around here. You know, we have a strong concentration of unemployed individuals 24 and up around here. Unfortunately, many of them are males. They're down in Lincoln now, or in Tecumseh. However, we still have a pocket of many who may not have the skill sets or the type of training and or direction to go after jobs around here. And that's why we have what they would consider a low unemployment rate around here, because we got two things working against our young men here. And even right now, I would say that young women ages 24 and up. The young men have two different obstacles that they're confronted with. One is that if they fathered a child around here, they have to fight the Child Support Enforcement Division. So therefore, they're sometimes hesitant to get a job. And if they get the job, it's always on the run, or they need to try and find a way to get paid under the table, which truly is against the law. Young women are strapped here, specifically if they have children, because there's insufficient support for a positive child care system here. So in this community, those are some of the things that hold our community back from advancing from an economic standpoint. Um,
So Dennis, if I'm hearing you well, you're saying basically, even though you advance some of these concepts, some of the opposition and elected officials who won the office didn't advance our community and they didn't deal with that. And it's obvious in evidence. You know, I had to laugh when you said
Absolutely.
some of these young
Absolutely.
men end up in the CUSA or the state pen because they didn't have jobs or they didn't have a quality education. And we know that if you don't get a good education, it can be a dead end. Some other thing. I'm gonna switch up if I can. Back in the day, we used to confront racial issues head on. What are we doing collectively today as African American? I'm thinking about the current climate today of how people are going around using the word racism and calling out these white supremacists and these apartheid institutions, organizations don't serve our community. And you got people who are basically becoming mouthpieces for the opposition instead of dealing with our community. So from your vantage point and your historical experience of growing up and living in Omaha and obviously living in California for a while, why are we not talking about these issues as an African American community today? Why not?
I think most of it is one's what they determine as their own self-economics. It's what I am getting. And if I talk and say what's right, I might lose that. I also lose a little prestige at the same time.
Okay.
I would say that accepting any 7 pieces of silver without having the ability to hold up your head and your dignity is 7 pieces of silver that you probably don't need. But money has had ability to sway people to look the other way. And I think that's one of the problems that we have in Omaha. You know, we talk about things like we want to utilize the democratic process around here. But I've seen in instances where some of our leaders, our so-called leaders, came to the community and said, oh, you know, we don't need to vote on that. Well, I think that anytime you make a decision on somebody else's life, it needs to go to the ballot.
Right.
And I could speak specifically about the juvenile justice system. Now, don't get me wrong. We may need a new juvenile justice center. I studied the model. It was discarded by the state of Minnesota. I don't know how we assumed that it would work so well here in Nebraska. It was almost like when people came to Africa and decided we would make good slaves, they held a piece of a trinket in front of us or a mirror, and we saw an image of ourselves, and we thought that was the greatest thing since sliced bread. But I think that some of our so-called leaders have duped and fooled this community. And at one point, we're going to suffer as a community because there's going to be taxes involved in that. And that's why I say that they should have always talked about improving this workforce, specifically with rates of pay, to where people could actually make a livable wage, because now we're heading to a possibly over a 35% tax on your wages, and that's pretty high. That's pretty high.
Dennis, one of the things that you alluded to, and I think part of what we're arguing here with more is we got to be much more flatten the pyramid or the curve so that more people have these conversations in our community. And again, one of the criticisms I'll have elected officials, I oftentimes use my experience in the Peace Corps in Africa, is that in the village, the head man or the head woman, and there were women who were in charge in different places, they always consulted with the people. They didn't go off and stay in their hibernated cave or whatever and call themselves speaking for people. And the other thing that we have done, and I go with Malcolm, is, you know, the small man, little man has nothing to lose, or the little woman. So we basically talking about people who are grass tops and grassroots need to be front and center in these decisions that impacts their lives. Nothing's more painful when you get taxed on something and people have never consulted you or even giving you adequate feedback because it's a done deal. So I think that's another thing. I'm going to switch up and ask a different question because I want to kind of cycle through kind of the concepts that we're trying to cover a lot of different topics to get people to get more involved. And that's kind of our main purposes, and more is to bring more people to the table and stop this surrogate behavior that we have with our community. How can we hold government and nonprofit folks accountable to address the fundamental issues affecting our community, such as the plantation educational system, Prison reform, you alluded to that a little bit. Prison over sentence of African American men to long-term sentencing as contrast to white men or white women in terms of what happens. How do we reverse that? And the reason I say that is if you look at the demographics, our demographics show that we're worse in every category, even though our numbers are small in some percentage, we make a disproportionate number. So how can we reverse that and hold government and elected and public officials accountable from your vantage point?
Well, I think you hitting the nail on the head there. One of the things I think we need to do is, one, educate our people in terms of when those dollars come to this state, if they're earmarked or targeted towards a specific group, we have to be able to create a base that identifies those dollars and ensure that they get where they go. I'll give you a perfect example. I worked for the United States Commerce Department and the Census Bureau. They put me in a position to be what was identified as a partnership specialist. And I knew at that time, I think it was $1,362 per person that actually filled out that questionnaire. And so I estimated how many million would come to, let's just say, an area like District 11. If we got Legislative District 11, if we got everybody to complete those census questionnaires, that was actually quite a bit of money, somewhere in the area of 40 million or something like that. But I was always told by the oppositional party, the GOP, you know, Dennis, you're working really hard to get those questionnaires filled, but we have to let you know a lot of that money might be redirected. Yeah. And I watched the same thing over the 2020 census as well. Now, my job wasn't to be go door to door to do census. What I did is I worked in a 9-state region where they could assign me to Arizona, to even California to work with the gang members, or to Denver or Utah. And what I would do was go and set up partnerships with either the clergy or some TV or radio station so that they would bring about the awareness of the importance of the census and how that dollar amount actually impacts a particular community.
So let me hesitate right there. For a person who doesn't know the importance of a sentence, whether we do the U.S. Census account, why is that important? If you had to distill it down to a sentence or two, why is that important? Why is that every 10 years people need to be counted? Because some people really don't understand that.
It determines how much money the state that you live in receives per person.
Okay, you mean state from where though? From who's giving you the money?
The federal government.
Okay, got you.
So, like for instance, in 2020, I think it went up to $22,062, something like that. So that was like a $700 increase over a 10-year period. And that take into place for the cost of living and a variety of other things, cost of healthcare, the cost of building new schools, So
based on your population of your state or your city or your community, that's sometimes proportional related to how much money you get from the federal government.
Absolutely.
Okay. Gotcha.
Absolutely.
And I don't think we've done a good job of explaining it because a lot of people, they fill it out, they do it more of as a rote process, but that's it. And then also, of course, it helps you determine who's going to be the numbers for your state in terms of Congress and so on, because some states shift and so on. But there's a little bit more public information, Department of Census, labor and so on, different need to educate our community, which for the most part, many of these public functionaries have not done it. And I'm quoting Frantz Fanon, he says, regardless of any concept or understanding, if you're good at what you're doing, you should be able to explain it to the average person, and we don't do that. We tend to explain it to each other. It's like watching the bobblehead people who get on TV and talk to each other about the same old stuff, read something off the internet that we already seen, but they don't deconstruct it or break it down so the average person understands it.
Well, I can tell you that in 2010, we got so many completed here in 2010 that allowed us to get that blue dot, that one
Okay,
congressional
got you.
vote
Okay,
that occurred in 2012. Um, so um, I know people were worried about my effectiveness in that job because there were constant barriers being put up in front of me. Like for instance, when they asked me to go and find facilities to where the actual census takers could work, and we set up our technical system, the people who were the most oppositional to me were some of the managers that were there, and they had no qualms about showing me how racist they were.
right.
I mean, they were real blatant with it. My boss, who actually operated out of Denver, Colorado, Littleton, she always protected me because she said, we need you there and in other places. I mean, they would take me to Las Vegas to chaperone the Secretary of Commerce. I never lived in Las Vegas, but I kind of knew my way around because I had family that lived there. But they gave me some pretty nice assignments to where I knew that I was effective wherever I went because I had the support of people. So yeah.
Yeah. One thing that I oftentimes don't talk about it, make a point. I know that you've been married for a long time. What's the success of staying married as an African American male, and give me a little bit more background, because oftentimes you don't hear people talk about family and children. And what I get disgusted and angry about is the lack of African American men in leadership roles in many of these white-dominated, white fragility nonprofits that supposedly serve our community, and particularly child welfare. They're very rare to see that. But talk a little bit more about that. And I know you get a lot of people asking those questions, but say something to me about that.
Well, I think one of the things that my wife and I, we have the same thing in common. She is in human resources. I like labor issues as it relates to the workforce. So we have a common bond there. In addition to having had the opportunity to live in different places. So we can discuss things from a labor perspective, from a family perspective. I think the one thing that we both have in common is that we have grown children, but we have kind of a partnership that I think a lot of people have it, but our commonality is that we kind of like the same things, whether it's hiking, walking, exercise and sports, political stuff. It's I know sometimes I probably bore her to death with my politics, but I believe in civil rights, and you mentioned that I worked for the Urban League here in Nebraska. I also had the opportunity to work for the Urban League in San Francisco, where we spearheaded many national type of programs to where people benefited from them. So a lot of that experience that I have, I actually acquired it here in Nebraska, working for Enron and being on loan to the city of Omaha.
By the way, how many years you guys have been married?
22.
Wow. Congratulations.
Yeah, 22. Yeah, 22.
Whenever a person asks you a question like that, especially in public arena, especially somebody as devious as I am, it's because I'm going to share a story also. But years ago, I got married, I think about the age of 23 or so. And so I've been married 42 years. And I got married in Africa when I was in the Peace Corps. But one of the things that I'm very much a strong proponent of families, pro-family, pro-children, you name it.
Absolutely.
14. And people ask you, how do you stay married for 14 years? I mean, for 42 years. I says, well, whatever she wants, okay, but keep Baba happy, as they say. But more than anything, you learn how to compromise, you learn how to talk about conflicts that you have. And what I find unfortunate is that we don't have a lot of programs, and I'll use family services, a good example, where they advance the cause of African-American families. And I see all this silliness that go on in the media where you have situations where people are talking about families and relationships from a white perspective, never from an African-American perspective. So that's one issue. Number two, and I'm gonna call him out, Willie Barney one time, he had some kind of pro-marriage or family issue. And I said, hey man, that sounds positive. I wouldn't mind come talking about that a little bit. He said, oh, Shimon, you're not a Christian, so you can't come with us. I'm like, what? What that do to the price of butter? And what I'm trying to say is your Christianity, your religion has nothing to do in terms of your fidelity. And I know a lot of Christians who cheat on each other, and that's where our community looks like it does. But I found it very offensive that he would say somebody to somebody in my character. Again, Willie is not from Omaha. He didn't grow up here. He's come in and done what he's done. And obviously he doesn't understand that some of us have more legacy and more history and credibility than to disregard people who have different faith beliefs or who don't believe in your white Jesus, as I would say. But my point is, if we see young men and women at a conflict and you see the media play us against each other, and I can tell you, I'm gonna use the Buffett Institute as one example, there's not a Black man working there, but yet they're really working with families. You look at the learning community, how many African-American men are there? So why is it these racist organizations get to pull our family apart, but they don't pull their families apart? We don't need folks to come in our community and play us against each other, which they do. And then we got some of these handkerchief head Uncle Mama, Aunt your mamas, who don't talk about why is it that we don't have the whole family represented? Again, in order to be born, you have to be born through a man and a woman. And so when we let these races do what they do, we get the dysfunctionality of our community. And as Elijah Ali used to say, when they introduced welfare and the way they played us, it started to break up our family. I think it's a little bit more deeper than that. I think it always go back to even slavery, the trauma we encountered in some of that. But I throw that out in public and everywhere, because if we don't begin to build the structure of the Black family, we're going to have this situation. If you put these Black men or African-American men in prison, you can't have these years of growing up and nurturing of making these healthy young men to stop being gang members or whatever. But if we ain't having these conversations, then you can see that some of the negativity that goes out there is not going to improve for our community. And these are conversations that we need to have among ourselves when having these white fragility imposters imposing on our families and our community. So I throw that out as some heavy light to say, at the end of the day, nothing from nothing leaves nothing from Billy Preston's point of view, but you cannot have a family without the connections of men and women, obviously with children. Again, you can define family differently, and I'm not saying that you can't, but I'm just saying for the sake of how we've evolved as Africans who were born in America, is that we come from a long history of people who understand our culture. So that's one of the things I want to throw back on is your religion and your lack of religion does not have to deal with how well your family structure is. And again, I know there are single family households out there who are stronger than some two family households. I know that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Like that. So I don't want to disregard single moms or dad who are doing great jobs. And I've heard some powerful stories over the years, but we cannot pigeonhole African-American men as negative and again, to have this sense of Negrophobia that these folks have in our community.
I think
go ahead.
This form of social engineering is going on here in the what I would call the northeast sector of Nebraska, specifically Congressional District 2. I think that it's done purposeful. And if you've noticed over the years, there's been a propensity to bring someone from the outside who's never walked on the streets of Omaha, who has never found a person a job, who has never ever provided any help and or support to a family that may be struggling, who has never helped the person fill out a voter registration form, who has never ever stood up for an injustice against a community. There has been a strong impact, and it's negative in Omaha, because if we could get the people to wake up here, and I'm going to simplify it for you. They bring somebody here from Diddy, why Diddy? We have no idea about his or her background. They empower them with a large salary, a nice place to live, and they bring them out and put them on TV and say, hey, you guys, this is your new leader. He's going to take over this program and this program and that program. And we don't stand up as a community and say, hold it. we need to investigate that background, because if we do, we may find out there may be some strong issues with that person. And if you notice, they come here, they get paid better than the people who've lived here and who struggle.
Yeah.
They get treated better. And we continuously accept that. I have a problem with that. And I think that's why they wouldn't identify a person like myself, and possibly even yourself, as leaders in the community, because we're objective and we see what's going on. May not like it, but we're not afraid to speak out against it. And I think that's what one of the problem is people have gotten accustomed to saying there's nothing you can do. Well, I always thought power was in numbers. And if we would be able to organize a little bit better, I think we could stop a little bit of what you're talking about. I do have a problem with, why do our young people go to college, get their degrees, when it's something as simple as getting a leadership position in their own community is very hard to obtain? You said it. We got all these nonprofits in this community. Tell me one that's spearheaded by a Black male or a Black female.
Wow. Well, I know there's not many, and even the ones who do, I question if they really have allegiance to the grassroots. And one of the things, Dennis, I'm going to say is look at their output. What have they done? And if you ask back in the day when I worked for Catholic Charities, my supervisor used to ask me, what are the three most important things you did this year in terms of me evaluating you? And how can you define it? And what are your outcomes and outputs? And how does it relate to our strategic plan? Well, I bet if you can ask that same question to some of these folks, they won't be able to answer that because they don't work in dealing with quantitative data, nor do they deal with any kind of empirical evidence-based type stuff that changes the narrative of the plantation system. Three quick points I'll make. One is we have an African-American superintendent in Omaha. And I know for years people have always wanted an African-American superintendent, whoever that is. My question is, how many community forums have that individual done in North Omaha without the handlers around and with grassroots moms and dads and people who have challenges in the school system? I don't think that's happened. And again, another example I'm going to say is the Department of Health and Hopeless Services in Lincoln. We had Courtney Weathers, who they brought in, I'm thinking from Arizona or Louisiana. I think it was Louisiana. She was here for a number of years. As soon as she got to getting her gravy train, she left and we didn't see her again. But I don't think she's ever done a community forum talking to people who are in the helpless and hopeless services about the quality of service they get. So you bring in dark-skinned faces in high places, but if they don't have no connections to the advocacy that why we want people there, it won't happen. We have a current director of HHS right now. I've never seen her in North or South Omaha engaging the families on their policies or deconstructing that whole system. We're talking about millions of dollars to go to help low-income, disabled people, you name it. And you got the head honchos who've never touched the hands of the clientele. That's kind of a strange scenario. And so I want to say, how do you have a legitimate system that really doesn't try to get closure to help people make it to the next level? Last point, I think, is related to all of this. You cannot, Dennis, have conversations about people without them being at the table in terms of you want to have permanency and outcome. So it's like me saying to you, yeah, I want to help you out, but I want to talk to you and I don't want to come to your community. If you've never been to North and South Omaha, how can you help those respective people? Or if you live in another city or another state and you come in every day like a certified carpetbagger, how can you help the very people you're talking about? So until we get people at our tables, and again, I get tired of being the only dark-skinned person who has a cognitive function raising these questions, but until we get enough of us around these so-called social justice tables, we're not going to solve many of these chronic problems that we face in our communities. And again, whether it be gang violence, poverty, crime, you name it, unemployment, poor education, I call it brainwashing, miseducation. Even the post-secondary education institutions, how many of them have credible people of color in positions speaking about this critical race theory, how it's a subterfuge or red herring instead of dealing with the real history that this country has inflicted upon people of color? Those are the kind of questions we need to talk about. So if you don't start with the right questions, you're going to get the wrong answers.
Absolutely.
We ask the wrong people the right questions, and sometimes we ask the wrong people the incorrect question. It goes all different ways, but I just think we got to have the conversation. If not, we're wasting our time, and there's just too much money wasted and lives lost in our system, and that we're building more prisons instead of building more schools to help these kids. And these were schools not in the sense of formal buildings, but schooling to help us show outcome. I know we're a little time we have here, but I was going to switch up and ask you another question. How do you call someone out when they have not addressed the concerns? Like, for example, I've been in many meetings where people will tell me stories and issues, and they say, don't quote me on it, even though it was true. They're not lying. You put them in court, they can't, you can't get them for lying. And my question is, am I speaking specifically about elected officials? I noticed on Facebook comments, you spent some time calling out the mayor, and you call out Ben Gray from time to time, who's no longer elected official, who totally didn't have much to show for his term in office. Who used to be the so-called Black city councilman from North Omaha. I know him and Ernie had a fallout. But how do you do that? And again, some people don't know. You get to call out elected officials because they're not protected by the certain laws as an average individual. So if I say our elected officials are incompetent, there's nothing they can do but just grin and bear. But how do you do that? And particularly when you do it on Facebook and you don't have no fear in doing that.
Well, because I go to the data, exactly what you said. What I want to do is I want to research what you have done, how many dollars you brought to this community, whether or not you, what the promise that you made before you were elected, whether or not you kept it or not. I look for those kind of things, which actually empowers me to go ahead and speak out against you. Because if I go and collect the data and the data says, you're telling the truth, I have no problem with putting you on blast if that's what you want to call it. And I'm currently working on something as it relates to the county now. For a county official, I want to know what increases or improvements have occurred since the day that he was elected. If the percentages are roughly 3 to 4 percentage points per year, then I know that was just automatic because of the cost of living increases, which tells me that he or she hadn't done anything to improve it. I'm looking for something along that 7 to 8% improvement in increase. That's a better gauge than 3%. So the problem is that we're collecting that data, whether you want to call it empirical or just rough, raw data, is the issue becomes mathematical. And when you talk like that, and trust me, sometimes I have to catch myself from doing that, but that's my nature. And I think that somewhere or another, we got to create a vehicle to where we lessen the frustration for people to understand that. In terms of what you just said, we got to break it down to where a common sense sentence educates a person and gets them on board, instead of having to go through the legalese and all the political rhetoric that people are accustomed to hearing. It just lists. He hasn't done anything. Every year, the county's going to get a natural increase because of certain issues. They also always raise taxes on people all the time. So if this person who is supposed to be our advocate for this particular district hadn't done anything, actually he has hurt and hampered us. Does that person deserve to stay in elected office? No, he or she doesn't. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to be confronted with as a community, is how do we really do a strong community evaluation on our so-called leadership around here?
Right.
I hear people say things like, oh yeah, that step up program, this, that. Man, that was the same program you and I worked in. They used to call it Summer Youth Corps, okay? Neighborhood Youth Corps. Okay. We all got,
back in the day, the federal government ran it, and it wasn't like out here begging for kibbles
Absolutely.
bits from private business. It was just part of business of government paid for, because the government subsidized a lot of other people like rich farmers and people with other kind of money. Even this COVID-19 is kind of disgusting how some people have gotten rich off of it instead of it going directly to the very people. I got to give credit to Reverend Portia Cavett in terms of her advocacy, but you shouldn't need advocacy if it's a basic public health issue and you got departments and people who should be sharing the love, making sure everybody has immunization. But part of what you're raising is the point is our ability as a community to communicate within effective media apparatuses. So back in the day, we had Channel 22, you had Tariq, you had Ernie, you had different people who would throw down some heavy light and get things to be cleaned up. I remember Matthew Stelly used to go around and film some of these slum landlords and ghetto-centric type people who were just oppressing the community. And now you don't see that. I mean, it's almost like we get on Facebook and we do what we do, but how can a community or group, anyone communicate if they don't have the means to do that? And I'm talking about a newspaper that gives you news that's 2 weeks old, or someone who's giving you the internet news, but we have to have some apparatuses where people get to speak truth to power and challenge each other. And again, no pain, no gain. I tell the story. Years ago, I took out a membership at every Blue Moon or Blue Moon gym and didn't go there for a year. And went to counseling. I said, "Why are you counseling?" Well, I didn't come here the whole year. Well, I couldn't go and work out if I didn't walk in the door and lift the weights, do what I got to do. So you got people who don't even attend school and who are talking about that. You got the debate about the Department of Education. When have you seen any official Department of Education in North or South Omaha engaging our community on how we can reform and improve our education system? I don't think so. So again, unless we're talking to the issues, and I'm gonna put some of the blame on us collectively.
Yes.
You know, if we as a community don't come to bear, then that shoe's gonna continue to pinch our feet.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the point right there. And the issue is what should drive people to come together, not to personalize with the individual or say, yeah, you know, that's Womack or that's Jamal. I don't want to go to that meeting. Well, if the issue that you and I are talking about impacts the community, it would appear that everybody would want to come to that meeting. But I think that they've got us to the point here in Omaha to where we personalize with each other too much.
What does that mean? Explain that a little bit more, Dennis.
They've created a lack of distrust towards each other.
I got you. Okay. Dishonesty, distrust among us, so we don't even trust our own people.
We don't even trust our own people, and that kind of shows in terms of what we would want to consider small Black-owned businesses. We won't support each other on certain issues. You know, you brought up something that I spoke out about when I appreciated what Portia Cavett did up there at Clare, where the county was absent of at that time, is they wanted to determine what was best for this community at that time. And I'm so glad that her and Sister Sharon spoke out against what happened. And to me, our representative from the county board should have been proactive. If they were saying that Blacks were underrepresented in terms of getting vaccinated and what have you, and we had all these apprehensions about it, but some of us have been vaccinated. If you're going to hold a community vaccination clinic, why would you just send one vaccine up there instead of all three of them? So you created a problem when the reality is that you could have been proactive. Okay, so I'm glad that Sister Cavett and Sharon came out speaking out against that, because the community need to know that. I mean, why would I go up there knowing that I took Pfizer and that's all they got is Moderna up there? Okay.
Well, and Dennis, I would even argue a little bit different that, number one, and I use myself as example, I tried to get on the internet to go get my initial vaccine. It couldn't get on. Every time I sign up, it jumped off or you couldn't schedule. And then I did a phone call to someone. Next thing I know, I was in like Flynn. But I noticed when I went at the Emmanuel Hospital, which doesn't have a great level of diversity and race in terms of their employment on some level, majority of the people who are getting their vaccine were not people of color. And so I would understand that if you want to make sure you get a high concentration, you almost start in those communities and you work with those leaders and get them to be hopefully role models to do that. But if you don't do that, if you don't have community outreach or engagement, and especially considering Tuskegee and all the racism we've experienced in this country, people are not going to jump out at you or trust you. And so I actually, I think we need to be more proactive. But anything, we need to get more speakers and people to be advocates. And I don't think we can pawn it off on one or two reverends in our community. There are a lot of people who are getting money from nonprofits to doing advocacy. Where are these nonprofits who are supposed to be speaking and working on behalf of the poor or those who are underserved? They should have been front and center, but you won't hear peep from them. So I even question their own legitimacy, why they should even exist. We need to do some kind of, as Senator McKinney had legislative resolution 172, where he says, we've had millions of dollars pumped into North Omaha, but the poverty rates keep going up. We had millions of dollars pumped in of government money, and people don't understand that there's no accountability for many of these organizations. I bet if you ask most of these organizations to tell you the number of people of color they serve or poor people, they couldn't tell you.
This is true. And I agree with Senator McKinney, because the millions that come in, the millions go right out. And that's what I mean by our leadership isn't in the community. Most of our leadership comes from out west, and then at 5 o'clock, they go back out west. So, I mean, that's the reality.
You kind of blunt there. You put that a little bit more blunt than I would have put it. They just, like carpetbaggers, fly in on the carpet, fly back out. It reminds me of when I was in Botswana, where the United States government would give millions of dollars to Botswana government for aid, but then they'd turn around and suck it all back up by sending their southern-born racist people to go over there and work. So in other words, they were hiring their own groups and people as a mini vacation using American dollars, and it sometimes didn't even make it to the very people in that country because they didn't have localization or making indigenous people having those opportunities to get that foreign aid. So it's almost like, what good is giving extra money to a school system if your academic rates keep going down? What good is having a new building if the very people who construct that building don't look like that community? These are the kind of questions that a person with a rational or sane mind should be asking, because some kind of way throwing money down rat holes is not changing the trajectory of our community.
Well, it hasn't improved the economic level here either. And several things that have occurred here that I've seen that have actually fostered what I think is a strong distrust amongst Blacks here. And I think that's allowed people outside of the community to come in and basically take over, because we don't have a focal point to where we need to look at and concentrate things on. Yeah, we know we got high levels of unemployment in North Omaha. What do we do about that? We should be seeking funding for advanced training. How do we make sure that the people actually receive that? I think a lot of the money that workforce dollars, whether it's coming from Wagner Pizer or WIA, Workforce Investment Act, I think a lot of it goes to Metropolitan Community College. I think the disconnect there is the mere fact of people thinking that they have to have certain requirements to get into certain occupational areas there. So we're a little bit apprehensive about going to college. And somehow we have to be able to clear that barrier so that everybody, you know, we talk about inclusion in this city. You know, I look at this city from the time that I was born and raised here. It's changed a lot. You know, we have now.
For the better or the worse?
Well, I think in many instances for the worse. We got Somalis, we got Sudanese, we have people from Myanmar here, Korean community. We got whites, Blacks, we've got Hispanics, and now we're all in this here fighting for the little crumbs that are left down here in North Omaha.
Right. In other words, we increase more pitting against each other, crawdad mentality. We only have like 5 minutes left, but I want to get two quick questions before we leave and give you a chance to say something. Oftentimes you hear people talk about this unicameral centric. We oftentimes talk about the unicameral only, as if all laws and all issues start down there. And we also have local governments. You alluded to county government, you alluded to, we talked about city government. Which one has the most significant impact on African Americans in Omaha and why? From your vantage point as someone who's been involved in different levels of government.
I think the legislature actually has more of an impact, and I'm starting to see it now in terms of some senators having issues with the chancellor at the university, with Chancellor Green down there. I think they're showing their true colors down there. However, I know that exists in city government here in Omaha as well. The problem that we have in city government is that we oftentimes don't put people who are truly concerned with the issues that face this most impoverished community, which is Congressional District 2. And they're absent of the issues that people are confronted with, whether it's low paying jobs that pay low wages, inadequate educational system. You know, they're not concerned about that. They say they are, but the real reality is that the city's working only to improve the city. The legislature is what I believe should be working to improve lives.
Okay. Gotcha.
And from the federal government standpoint, the reason why a lot of these things have happened is that we haven't had a Democrat in office who's done anything for this community except Bob Kerrey and Ben Nelson tried. The problem was that the so-called Black leadership at that time, they had no idea what the community needs really were. And I think that held this community back enormously from a financial standpoint, from educational standpoint, because we didn't have that coalition that you're talking about. People who would actually speak the truth and tell people where it hurts. If you keep hitting me, I'm gonna tell you where it hurts, and I might retaliate back at you, and I'm gonna tell the truth. You know, y'all need to get y'all's foot off of our neck.
But get your foot off my neck.
We've allowed them to come in and take over programs that we should be running down here. Our kids' opportunities are limited. When they graduate from college, they have to go to another state in order to pursue.
Which is unfortunate. I'm always reminded of these trivial scholarships where they give to some of these so-called elite Negroes and people. And after they get their scholarship and they get their degree, then they leave town, and there's no obligation to stay and help the masses. So just because you got a scholarship, that don't mean nothing for our community. It's obvious it hasn't mean anything. We're down to the last couple of minutes, and I wanted to make sure I give you a chance to have some closing comments for our viewing audience. And by the way, this will be posted on the More webpage. And obviously, when you speak truth to power, you get to say what you need to say. But Dennis, what are some of those things you would leave our listening or viewing audience in terms of this conversation from your vantage point?
Well, I think that there's a few things that I see that's really going on in this community. And I think that I do believe we've got a lot of people who want to do what's best. I do believe that there are people who want inclusion. I do believe there are people who want to support what's right in this community. I just think that there's some forces out there that are damned and determined to keep things the way they are here in North Omaha and what I would consider the Northeast sector. And I think what you're hitting on here is going to do one or two things. It's either going to bust this city wide open to where the type of dialogue that's needed in order to make positive change begins to occur, or we're going to go backwards and start hiding from the truth again. And I see that's happening right now down in the state legislature, is that people are hiding behind their real hand. And it's unfortunate because these are elected officials. But what we need is people who are going to speak the truth, who have lived the life, who understand the conditions of this community. And if you haven't lived in poverty or in this area, I don't think you're really suited to to actually be a leader here. And it's really showing that. See, you and I would never have the opportunity for them to say that, yeah, Jamal Byndon, he's a leader. They're not going to come and tell you that Dennis Womack's a leader, because we're not speaking the language that they want us to say. We're
Right.
speaking the truth. And that's what I think that really matters. And as you know, and I know, the truth always going to set you free.
There you go. Well, on that note, Dennis, I really appreciate Dennis Womack, you talking, and we call this like throwing out some heavy light for more. We do believe in freedom of speech, but also what's more important than freedom of speech is freedom of thought. And if we don't begin to banner and have these conversations in our community, then we're going to go backwards. And trying times require some extreme methods to improve for the life for those at the bottom. So really appreciate you being with us today. We hope you've enjoyed this edition of Throwing Out Some Heavy Light, and hopefully we'll have other editions where we throw that back. So as we always end, good night, or Barocco. Take care.
Thank you.